Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Making the Business Case for Federated Single Sign-On. We'll just wait a couple of minutes to allow more people to join, and then we'll go straight in. So before we get going, I just want to run through a few housekeeping things. So first of all, we are recording the webinar, and the webinar recording will be sent out to you probably within a week. We need to make sure that the recording has transcription and closed captions for accessibility. So it takes us a little bit of time to get those ready and up on our YouTube site. If you have any questions of your own around this topic, if you could post them in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. And we'll get to those sort of towards the end of the webinar after our initial set of questions. If you have any other queries, if you could please post those in the chat. And just to let you know that live transcription is on, so you can toggle on and off for closed captions. So I just want to introduce you to today's chair for this webinar, Emma Wilson-Shaw, who's our e-resource manager. So I will now hand over to Emma.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are in the world. Great to see everybody today. So our session today is looking at why librarians are choosing federated single sign-on. No doubt you're aware over the last few years there's been challenges for organizations wanting to deliver access to their subscribed content wherever their users happen to be in the world. And publishers and organizations alike need to make sure that this access remains secure, reliable, scalable, and seamless. In our webinar, our guest speakers will talk about their experiences of federated single sign-on and making the business case in order to future-proof access to organizational resources. So I'm the e-resource manager for Open Athens. I've been with Open Athens for about 3 years now, but I came from the higher education library sector in the UK, where I worked for around 20 years. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our panel for us today, just in order that I could see them. So first of all, we have Hongma.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hong Ma. I'm head of library systems and also interim associate dean at Loyola University Chicago. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Hongma. Thomas, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Thomas Dowling. I'm Director of Technologies at the Z. Smith Reynolds Library at Wake Forest University. And our particular configuration, the technology team includes the electronic resources librarian, so that's somebody that I've worked very closely with for a number of years and has been instrumental in helping with this. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Thomas. Jason, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Griffey. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives for NISO, the National Information Standards Organization. And I work very heavily with the Seamless Access project, where I do a lot of very high-end sort of infrastructure work in the federated authentication space. But prior to all of that, I was the head of IT for the library at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga for about a decade. So I have a big, wide background in libraries and technology in general, but I'm here today to talk largely about and help answer infrastructure questions about this, this space. So good to be here.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason. Kelechi, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelechi Okere from Elsevier, based in New York. My role is I work as an outbound product director, or in this case, customer segment, identity customer segment director, looking after our health markets. Before this role, I spent a good number of years in sales, working with academic libraries here in the United States and across the world. So Thanks for having me today.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. We'll move through to our questions. We have a good range of them. Hopefully, we'll get through them in the time. This is probably a question for anybody. Where are you on your federated single sign-on journey? Who'd like to go first?
I'll tackle that because we have a very simple and very informal answer. This is something that we have been adding in addition to other forms of authentication where it's available and easy to do. So it's sort of a stealth operation for us, and it has just something where an increasing number of sites that we want to connect to support it, and we've been able to add it pretty easily.
Excellent, thanks, Thomas. Does anybody else like to go for this one?
Yeah, I'll jump in and add that, for us at Elsevier, we've been on this journey for the past 15 or so years, making federated access available. Though when we look across with customers, it hasn't always been something that customers leveraged a lot, and that's before COVID. And we saw a jump in that after COVID or during COVID. But it is also now something that we're putting a lot more effort into, because we recognize that there is a huge challenge with users getting access to materials outside of the IP range. But I think more and more what we've also recognized is that federated access is the way of the future. So our work now is to look at how do we address that in a much better way than maybe we have in the past, and serve users and customers than we have in the past. So I'll sum that up to say that for us, it's an evolving journey where we are still learning, the way that users are going and how do we meet them where they are.
Excellent. Yeah, good point. Hong, did you have a follow-up to that?
Right. I want to quickly mention from the academic library point of view. As a head of IT, I have been following the trend, federal authentication, even through the community like ER&L, since the RA21, which is resource access for 21st century. As we all know, like our user no longer just come from desktop or laptop. They use a variety of different approach. So with that being said, the Loyola University Chicago, we kind of started officially, our journey was during the pandemic. It happened to, after the campus shut down, our EasyProc server was ITS side was somehow got a file. So we have 2 days without remote access, which was so crucial, right? As you can imagine. So that was like trigger us. We started our open license journey. So we spent like 6 months or so, moved majority of electronic resources through the open license. At the same time, I guess Jesse and Kelechi will talk more vendor side, right? The federal authentication journey already started. Also, same there, the pandemic HardyTrust, which is use another federation in commons. So our user kind of already familiar with that route. So since 2020, now we are approaching like almost 3 years. We still have our easy proxy server kind of treated as our redundancy if anything happen, if we need. But majority of our resources already through the open license. And also because we are multi-branch campus, the health science library and the law, they have separated administration. So right now we are in the process of bringing the additional health science library. They also have a different type of user group, like a residency, that type of thing. So we are planning to bring them on board for next year also.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate from the sort of broader perspective, looking at it at the infrastructure level, seeing the pattern of more and more and more federated authentication being used broadly across not just academic libraries, of course, but also research institutions, medical centers, law schools. That type of access is more and more common, and I think broadly, not only for students but for faculty and such as well, with more and more remote work. We're seeing, again, Thomas and Hongma both and Kelechi all mention that as a sort of driver for a move towards getting the thing you need wherever you happen to be on whatever device you happen to be on, and that is definitely true here in the US. It's also sort of increasingly true internationally, which is these federations extend across borders as well, and so being able to use a single sign-on in areas where you may be not just in the same place all the time is a big deal.
Thanks for that. It's kind of a follow-up. Why is federated single sign-on important to your organization? Thomas.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on this. I did a quick survey this morning of services on campus, and we use our campus single sign-on to get people to our email, our office apps, our learning management system, our student information system, our financial system, our library catalog back-end and front-end, and even our easy proxy. Not a one of them cares where you are physically located. They care about your single sign-on. And so it is absolutely an expectation for our users, and any system that essentially says, when you see a link, whatever you do, don't click on that link, but go back to the library webpage and figure it out from there, it's so counter to the user expectation that it's worth it to build the tools to make the web work the way our users want it to.
Excellent, Polly, definitely. Anybody have a follow-up to that one?
Yeah, I want to quick, pretty much is just to concur Thomas just said, right? I think our user has been, for years as a library, we are achieving our internally Loyola single sign-on, right? Like you log in this, then you are able to access other systems. But federal authentication is really like a single sign-on for a broader view, right? Pretty much no matter where you come from, if you're Googling resource, come to the resource site and identify you are affiliated with our institution, then you get the resource. You no longer require you always force you to come to the library webpage, follow through the some kind of a user journey to access that. So I think that's really reference libraries front-end focus realize that's a user need. So yeah. And also to be able to understand user pattern, right? Because again, as Thomas said, it's no longer a single gateway. It multiple ways they can access our resources.
I want to pick up on what Hongma was saying about user patterns. As a publisher, it's important to understand users, right? To be able to innovate on the services that we're delivering to users. And without data, it's hard to innovate, right? It's hard to modify a product in a way that is much more responsive to the way that users want to use the product, right? So that's where federated access becomes so crucial, right? That we know that no product can sit static without any updates to it, right? Some products try to do that, but and then you start to see usage decline. So for us, it's about continuing to deliver value to users, and a way to doing that is understanding their patterns, And that's what Federated Access helps us in doing that.
Yeah, if I could just follow up just a little bit with what Kelechi just said. The other thing, though, that's important to understand from the sort of library point of view organizationally is when federated authentication is implemented and sort of, I'll say properly, right? There are always problems if things aren't set up and monitored, but if it's set up properly, it's extremely privacy protecting for the user. And so any sort of enhancement of privacy issues having to do with information seeking in the library environment is something that I think librarians in general are super interested in. So I think that from an organizational standpoint is also an advantage to this sort of technology.
Thanks, Jason. Definitely. Okay, shall we move on to the next section? It's probably more Hong and Thomas, I think. Look, everybody feel free to chip in. In terms of making a business case, which stakeholders did you need to engage with to be able to kind of put forward a business case for federated single sign-on? And how did you do it?
I think I can answer this quickly and get out of the way because, as I said before, ours is sort of a stealth operation, and we haven't needed to get an awful lot of buy-in. It has been useful to take the opportunity to do some instruction around the library on how exactly IP authentication works, and especially how proxy authentication works as compared to a seamless single sign-on or seamless access model or something like that. Really, the biggest thing that we had to do was find the one person in our campus IT structure who was working with SAML permissions and assertions, and really get sort of a checklist of this is how you set it up, this is what you have to have them contact me about. And from that point on, it was pretty straightforward for us. So it hasn't been something where we've had to dismantle anything that stakeholders would get upset about, and we've just kind of been plugging away on our own, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, I can say a little bit more about multiple stakeholder groups. Thomas kind of addressed campus ideas. I feel like it's also very challenging internally because our current IP-based authentication is still working fine, right? Why you want to change? Also echo Thomas said, I think in my institution, we have been trying to provide some basic understanding about what's different, how this will do, how this will, especially from my point of view, at the beginning, people felt like this is only technology upgrade, right? So it's kind of basically library IT, you're saying, but really toggle the user experience. So we have been doing a lot of internal presentation to our staff, also target our public service focus, like those reference librarians, just to really translate this in the very practical user-genuine way to educate them what this means to them, rather kind of a take off those technical piece, but just only focusing on, and also we might well toggle later about the user privacy part, things like that. So our people has a fundamentally already well educated before the pandemic hit. Again, as I mentioned, so there was kind of a particular trigger move us to officialize this. But I feel like communities, the entire librarians and library community needed to aware about what it is, how this impacts us. Another thing I want to say is, like I mentioned, IP-based is working fine, right? Why change? But also, I think our reference librarians realize the user already start use, even before we implement, because the vendor side or other parties already have certain sensitivity labeled. And also our campus IT, as because we are part of InCommon, is another federated authentication they already have a lot of other services going on. We also campus level have a multi-factor authentication enabled. So library has been partner with them to help them to kind of move in that direction. So strong relationship with ITS also very helpful. They are for shared understanding from both parties.
Can I add to that? And I'm glad you, Hama, you touched on that relationship with Central IT. In the cases of customers that I've worked with in the past, I also spent 2 years before this role just looking specifically at federated access and what does it take, to work. So those relationships came up again and again with Central IT as really important as one of the major stakeholders. And then the other one was also the vendors, right? So the relationships with publishers or other providers to the library that also became important for libraries to explore, right? Because in some cases, either the vendor may or may not have the most optimal setup, right? In terms of also how the kinds of attributes that they request, or the setup, that's privacy preserving. So I would also add the vendor relationships as a key stakeholder to talk to.
Definitely, thanks, Kelechi. We'll probably move on to the next one because I think we've kind of covered the next question I was going to ask. So probably one for everybody. What's your advice that you would give to others who are stepping out on the federated single sign-on journey? Any top tips?
Well, I think some of that got covered previously. A relationship with people in your IT organization, so that they know what you're doing and you know what they need you to be doing. Communication with your front-facing librarians, especially if you are making this the top priority for authentication, or in fact the only means of authentication. I don't know that anyone is doing that yet. I'm seeing questions like that in the Q&A. But if you're getting to the point where you're talking about doing away with IP authentication in favor of federated authentication, that obviously takes a lot of communication.
Yeah, I would echo that. Also add something like when you communicate with a kind of a different type of stakeholders, use their language, right? Or maybe like, for example, when we communicate with our ITS, because they also very care about security or privacy, right? As they are implementing other things. So again, just to kind of set up some stage for both parties. That's why library, we also started this journey. So first we'll get their attention and putting a priority for project to work with you. And the second tip is, I feel like sometimes you feel like this is technology piece, ITS will take care, but because of still kind of come from different sector, right? So I would highly recommend like an internal group, like my group, we fully kind of trying to own the understanding or build the knowledge ourselves, be able to leverage particular technology piece to them, say, here is exactly we need you to do, right? Rather than say, we are doing this, can you figure out? So that could be buried for months or something, nobody, right? But if you have someone as a point person, tech-oriented, it's totally fine if you are not fully knowledgeable on that sector, but as kind of a bridge between like in our case, between the OpenSN and ITS, be able to connect them together. That's kind of a very needed. That's why I feel like a librarian, we needed to be knowledgeable to some extent, not fully rely on your IT. Yeah.
Great point.
Yeah, one suggestion I would give, I mean, there's all the, sort of technical talking to everyone and all of that, but one suggestion that I would give, especially to the academic librarians that are listening, is to pay attention to the user experience of edge cases in your space. The single sign-on simplifies a lot of things, right? You get sort of the same experience for a lot of different products, a lot of different pathways to information, but your individuals that you're helping may have very complicated relationships across things. So just one example that we've struggled with as far as user experience are things like faculty members who have more than one affiliation, whether that's internally to your organization or even across organizations, right? Their experience of like picking the right picking the right affiliation to use when they're signing on sometimes looks really weird, and it's sometimes a hard sort of user experience problem for them to solve, and they may not sort of know how to navigate that. So, and that's true for students who may be dual enrolled, or that's true for, there's all sorts of unusual edge cases for most academic institutions that don't come up in corporate environments or don't come up in other environments. And so doing sort of hands-on user testing with people in unusual situations helps the librarian understand those sorts of complicated complicated interactions that sometimes come up. So I would say don't ignore getting your hands on some of the sort of experiences that your users are going through and making sure that you understand some of those complexities, because that can be hard to troubleshoot when you don't understand it.
Very good point. Kelechi, did you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, it's just really a wrap of what everyone else has said, and also based on the experience or the learnings from the customers that I've worked with that went through the journey. Treat it as a project, as you would treat any other major initiative as a project, right? With an owner of it that looks at especially the user experience and what impact it would have for users and how it would make users' lives much better. Talk to your vendors about it, especially your biggest ones. Find out what their setups are, right? Because I think one of the things I learned is that the biggest factor for people about federated access is privacy, right? So there's this idea that it's not privacy preserving. And that can be true if it's not set up the right way. So just really talk to your vendors and talk to also people to make sure that it's set up the right way, and that you're not releasing personal identifiable information with it. Yeah.
Excellent point. Thanks, Kelechi. Our next question is around kind of standardizing and scaling up. So, I mean, I know Jason comes from a standards organization, so it might be one for you, but I guess in terms of scaling up, obviously Thomas has already talked about the stealth approach, but it'd be interesting to know what views are on kind of standardizing and scaling up.
So I think, I mean, again, one of the advantages for single sign-on is the mostly uniform, I won't say entirely uniform, but mostly uniform experience across multiple products, right? That comfort of sort of a single pathway to get to whatever it is you're looking for, rather than the traditional, like going through the pathway from the library website. You just click the link and your sign-on is there. That standardization of user, at least expectation, if not always the same user experience, is really, really great for users. You get a comfort in knowing what's going on there, and it does allows sort of an easier scaling, I think, and Hongma or Thomas might want to speak to this, but scaling of institutional resources, in that you've got the setup, and you've got the once you have sort of single sign-on working, adding to it across products, across new resources, etc., becomes, from an internal sort of perspective, a little more straightforward. But they can speak to that more directly than I could. So
Thanks, Jason.
Let me just say this. We are sort of at the point where we have shared SAML information with a large number of publishers, and it gets to the point where it's like, how well does that scale? Because if we had to change anything, how do we contact everybody and get back? But what's the comparable operation with IP range management? We discovered recently that we have a branch campus in Charlotte, North Carolina. We discovered recently that for at least a couple of years, we were giving all of our publishers the wrong IP addresses for our Charlotte campus. Simple communication miss there. And we never heard about it because they had decided at some point, if you want to use library stuff, you're going to have to use the VPN because they don't do IP authentication right. There's going to be a workload on either side. But on the whole, the scaling issue for us is not a big thing with a single sign-on.
Yeah, I feel, again, as we touched about pandemic, remote access becomes so crucial, right? So it really, I think the user experience, as Jason said, at least, user figuring out the multiple ways, be able to retrieve the article, whatever they need. But however, I also want to say, because multiple party, or including our vendors, content providers, they are at a different stage of federal authentication, sometimes we also face some challenges. So I think that's a part of a reason I'm kind of advocator for all parties come together, think about this journey, standardize. One example is, as I mentioned, and not derail our agenda, but because we are in common federation and we also open access federation, right? So some vendors said, where are you from the drop-down menu? Loyola University Chicago shared twice. So that was for a while, raised some confusion, but the ITS kind of from their point of view, they are not willing to merge, which is understandable, right? But finally, we were able to find a solution, just naming the entry as a library with library brand, so user has a clear thing. So I think we are still in the journey, but as Jason said, I think in general, I feel like users figuring things out, the reference libraries helped. It's not just get that buy-in, because I think it is a part of rolling this out. They are very essential because they are the one first heard from the user. We have them triage, and also for technical things, kind of goes to the tech team, but they are able to knowledgeable enough to get user the help they need.
Excellent, thanks, Hong. We've got, looking at the question box and our questions. I'll probably do another couple of hours and then we'll move to the epic amount of questions that we've got coming. So last couple, we've probably covered this a little bit already, but in terms of benefits, we're just wondering, I guess for each of you, what do you see as the benefits of single sign-on for your organization, for your users, or just for your day-to-day work?
Something I touched on earlier, but a real benefit for our users, especially in the last few years as we have gotten more and more remote students and remote workers. A model where you have to go to the library website first and follow links from there to get to something is not the user's expectation. The user's expectation is you see a link to something, you click on it. And especially as we have, worked to put things like digital object identifiers in every citation format. When you see a citation, there's a link, and it doesn't go to your proxy. Just user expectation up one side and down the other is the big thing for us.
Just very quickly, as Thomas already covered so well about improve the user experience. I also want to toggle Kelechi mentioned about the, I think the federal authentication, some of those type of technology attribute release, right? If we understand enough about what we can control, talk with vendor about that, I think it really benefit is you can really set up who can access to what, right? In our situation, we do have some resources limited to certain type of a user, like our health science campus. So the flexibility and the scalability about to be able to configure with what group of user can access what resources. Alumni user, right? They might still have access to certain resources. So we have that type of flexibility, I think is really wonderful. And again, toggle back, right? Once you have that, you also have a better understanding about which group is using your resources. So as far as your IT identity management system working with you can have really leverage the attribute release and configure the statistics usage tied with certain attribute is really great to be able to make a kind of a more tight connection with your user needs and understand your collection development, right?
I'll you're such a good you always give me good layups, to use a basketball analogy. To add on to what you were saying about tailoring your collection development. So for me, user experience as a publisher, and also innovation. So I'll use an example of something that's been a lot of customers have been asking us for at Elsevier for a long time, which is to be able to understand usage of, let's say, ScienceDirect, let's say on a departmental level or on a group level, right? And that is something that we could not deliver, with IP access or with federated access, that we're now able to deliver, right, with ScienceDirect, where a library can say, well, we want to understand usage on a demographic, whether it's undergraduates or graduate students or different departments, right? We can now deliver that kind of usage to libraries as long as they are as long as users are coming through federated access. And that is something that you couldn't do with IP-based access, right? And that has multiple benefits for the university, as we've been told. And there are other examples, but I'll just use that for now. So I think for me, it's user experience, improved user experience, and also innovation around the services that we are delivering.
Great. I don't know, Jason, if you wanted to talk about the contract language.
I was going to mention. I did have Jane pop that into the chat. It actually, I was setting up one of the Q&A things for later. Somebody asked about licensing.
Okay.
There, so I can wait and just mention it then.
Okay, sure, no problem. So we've got one more question, which is actually basically for Kelechi and Jason. Why should publishers adopt federated single sign-on? What's the advantage there?
Kelechi is definitely the expert there, but maybe I can give him another layup, and that is, he just spoke about sort of the ability to do much more finely grained sort of statistics and analysis of what's being used and where. You also have the ability, again, depending upon sort of how things are set up and what the agreement between the publisher and the library is, to do, as Hong Ma said, much more finely grained sort of usage packages, where you get usage packages of resources for particular groups in particular ways, which for publishers I think is a big advantage over a lot of the more traditional ways of doing authentication. But I'll let Colette. This is much more Colette's area.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to user experience, and I'll use actually Thomas's article, right? We have overgrown IP based authentication, right? To say for us as a publisher, the people coming to our platforms, right? Wherever they are, right? Whether you're on a computer or your mobile phone, you're also using social media. You're also using, banking, e-commerce, right? And the experience there is quite different, from the experience when you're trying to come to a resource like ScienceDirect, right? So for us is trying to meet users where they are, where the world of the internet has evolved to, is meeting users what the expectations are. It's also about innovation, right? So again, I mentioned that with federated access, we're able to innovate on the services. I gave the example of more granular usage reporting. But kind of understanding user patterns also helps us understand how do we need to innovate on the product, on the user experience. There's a really good article in the Scholarly Kitchen by Tim Lloyd and Letty Conrad, around this, right? Called Driving Responsibly, and all the different benefits that comes with federated access that publishers should consider. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'll stick to those two: user experience, better user experience, and more innovation around services that are being delivered.
Excellent, thanks, Kelechi. We have a lot of questions, so and a limited amount of time, so I think we should probably move to them. We'll try and see if we get through as many as we can, and if there are any that we don't get to, we will answer those and follow up a little bit later on for you. Okay, so Deborah has a question around walk-in use. Probably a question for Thomas and Hong, I'm guessing. Is walk-in use more complicated for databases where you have single sign-on authentication? Do you offer dual authentication paths?
The answer at our end is yes, we definitely offer both IP and single sign-on where single sign-on is available, and will for the foreseeable future. When and if we reach a point where any publisher says, you can't do IP authentication anymore, we need you to go through federated authentication, that becomes a significant challenge. But it's a challenge for which people have expressed solutions. You would essentially need to have guest identities that you would let people sign into, and then that becomes their single sign-on. The mechanics of doing that will require work with your campus IT. Hong, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
We are exactly on the same boat. I also want to add a part of a reason is some small publishers, they are still not fully federated authenticated, approach. Similar, as a library, not everyone on the same page. I just want to mention, because we're using OpenEssence, OpenEssence does provide a mechanism, still treat OpenEssence as a proxy. So that's why we are kind of still combine the both model here. It worked pretty well, and gradually, since we're already approaching 3-year window, right? I do see a lot of content provider publisher moved from proxy to federal authentication, which again, it's something we didn't talk about. That I guess that's a challenge for library, keep track, switch them off. But anyway, right now it's kind of parallelly.
One, I'll add to that. We work with University of Melbourne in Australia, where they moved completely away from IP-based access and moved to federated access. And walk-in user was one of the challenges that they had to solve, and they figured out a way to do that. I don't have all the details, but I wanted to call that out for anyone that's interested in going to their website or getting in touch with them to ask questions about that, about the details of how they are now managing walk-in users.
Kelechi, I can quickly, not really try to fully answer that because we are not really switch walk-in user, but I just want to point out Open Access provide a mechanism to create a personal accounts. That's how you can expel those accounts in certain day, like in 1 day or in 2 days or a week. So we have been use this for when we need to create a test account for vendor because they need when troubleshooting, things like that. It worked also pretty well.
The underlying technology for federated authentication, Thomas used the term SAML, right, which is the sort of underlying language that is used to transmit the authentication information back and forth from the publisher to the local campus. There's a lot of ways in the sort of technical infrastructure to manage whitelisting existing computers, if it's particular computers that you would like to have whitelisted for walk-in users. There are multiple ways to do, as Hongma and Thomas both said, sort of standing guest user accounts. There are the technology is fairly robust in supporting multiple ways to sort of make that experience happen. It's going to be up to the individual campuses to figure out what sort of makes sense for their particular uses. But there's nothing about federated authentication and single sign-on that sort of makes that an impossible situation. You just have to figure out what the best way is. And part of the issue is this is still an ongoing process, and no one sort of has modeled the perfect way to do it that everyone else can jump on. But the technology absolutely supports multiple ways of sort of handling that process.
Thanks, Jason. I've just, James kindly posted a link from the Open Athens docs, which explains a few options that you can use with Open Athens, like access accounts. There's a myriad of ways of doing it, but just things that people could have a look at.
And if I could provide, sort of one counterpoint that's maybe, not the way we like to approach products, but if any of us wanted to license a product that prohibited walk-in users, federated access would give us a way to do that. That wouldn't be my first choice of a license, but if that was our only choice, we would at least have a mechanism to support it.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, next question. We've kind of answered this a bit already, but Caleb had a question around what the advantages are for federated single sign-on over using IP authentication in conjunction with a VPN. I don't know if folks have experience of using VPNs in their institutions and what works better.
I can add to Caleb. I can, because Caleb then further clarified or gave more color to his question. And I can touch on that. So I think the advantage when you have, let's say, multi-site, especially in this case, it's a hospital, and there are different, care providers that have all their affiliations. In this case, actually, it would allow you to be more targeted as to which site can access which resources and who within these sites can access which resources, which you cannot do with IP, or at least it's not that easy unless you know the specific IP addresses for each building, right? Or where these users are located. So federated access, because you are connecting to the Active Directory, from that standpoint, you could actually be a lot more targeted as to which users and which populations are able to be authorized for access to particular resources. I hope that answers your question, Caleb.
I want to add quickly to hope this may be also helpful. Yeah, Kalichi, you made it very clear about it, right? VPN basically put your off-campus machine become on campus, right? So just like make your machine like on campus. So that's a mechanism. But in our case, during the pandemic, our faculty staff, we do have VPN access, but it's also require install some client on your machine and connect the multi-factor authentication. Anyway, that worked fine for faculty. But however, our student group, in our case, they don't have access to VPN. So that created a lot of a challenge for them to remote access. Another thing I also want to mention is, again, we have some international students, someone in China. Because of a firewall setup, something, they are not able to use VPN. So that's also, again, it's very different mechanism, but Kalichi made it clear. Again, the federal authentication is no matter where you are, you will be the same. You don't need like, again, required to go click a certain link. Thomas and others already addressed earlier on. So I think, again, the VPN is only just the saturated your machine become the on-campus from off-campus.
Great, thanks, Hung. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions. Let's see how we go. So Catherine has a question. Will you be running IP authentication in tandem with single sign-on, or are you planning to switch off IP authentication altogether? If the latter, how are you justifying this scenario as it's known to work for those who are on site?
We're definitely not turning off IP authentication anytime soon. I think in situations where it works, we're saying it isn't broken, don't fix it. But so you know, as I said several times, we're looking at single sign-on as an addition to, not a replacement for.
Yeah, we are the same, exactly like Thomas said. We use Easy Proxy Server as our redundancy. I mean, Focus might be familiar, right? Academic libraries use this discovery layer, and something. Sometimes if we also use as a part of a troubleshooting, kind of a temporarily, quickly, provide alternative ways for access if one resource have any issue.
Thank you both. We've just got time for one more. Peter asks, are you providing resources to partner institutions with different licensing arrangements, and how easy do you find managing this scenario? I don't know if Jason wants to chip in with his licensing thing.
I was going to say, I because it was a licensing question, I did want to point out that I have worked with a group from Seamless Access on a model license agreement for federated authentication. It doesn't exactly answer this question, Peter, because again, if you're doing cross licensing with another institution rather than licensing with a resource provider, we concentrated our model license language on the licensing between the library and the publisher, right? Library and a resource provider. Mostly because existing licenses almost entirely rely on network or IP level licensing language, and don't include things like which information is shared with via entity categories in the transmission of the data between the two institutions, between the library and the publisher. And so that piece of the agreement is really important for the library and for the publisher. And so the fact that most licenses that libraries currently use don't include that is something that's really going to have to be sort of changed institutionally. You're going to have to think about it a little differently. And I did work with a group of both publishers and librarians in the Seamless Access project to provide a model. It's not necessarily exactly cut and paste, but it gives you some language that you can use for those agreements as they start to crop up. I have not had any experience between sort of resources across institutions. Kelechi may be the best one here for that. I don't know. Have any of you actually had that situation come up?
I mean, it's no, I mean, yeah, in this case, yeah, it doesn't. Trying to see the best way to answer it. I think the majority of licensees are still being signed with IP-based access. But the way that we approach it is that we accommodate both, right? So, if a school, if a customer wants to use IP, that's always there. And also simultaneously with federated access. So that provision is made, right? But if I mentioned we work with University of Melbourne, that has been also some other institutions that decided to move away from IP completely, right? And just have federated access. That's also fine, right? I mean, as a big publisher, we can support that. Not every publisher can support that, but I think you have to kind of like take it on a case-by-case basis with different publishers and libraries.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelechi. We're almost at time, so I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel for all of your input so far. I know there are folks who didn't get their questions answered, but we will follow up with you a little bit later on. Jane, I think there's a resource kind of slide after this one, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent.
So yeah, this is a resource list of some of the things that we've covered off today. So this will be included as a link to SlideShare in the follow-up communications. Also, if you're attending any of these events, please do swing by the Open Athens exhibit stand to ask our team any questions that you might have around federated authentication and single sign-on. There's a QR code there, so you could just use the code to go straight to our events page. And also just to call out an ALA session, federated authentication, does enhancing user experience mean libraries need to sacrifice privacy? So that's on Sunday, the 25th of June. And please do go along to that session if you're attending ALA and ask any further questions there. And just to say thank you to Emma and all of our esteemed speakers, and of course to you, our wonderful audience. We will be going through the questions that we couldn't get to, and we'll add those to an FAQ page, and again, link to that in the post-webinar comms. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.